Hello and welcome again to another episode of the Cliff Notes podcast, where we ask a leader and find their way. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Broome, digital inclusion strategist at Dig Inclusive, who helps agencies deliver accessible customer experiences and training strategies. How are you doing today, Grant?
I'm doing all right, Tristan. How are you doing?
Cool. Bit of a mouthful. I think I got through that in the beginning. Give it back to me in your own words. Where does that fit in the sort of grand scheme of things, and what do you work on?
Well, so what we do at Dig Inclusion is help people to understand more about web accessibility. And around 20% of the population have a disability, and that sometimes means that they will have difficulty using a computer or a mobile phone or some other device in a conventional way. So the term web accessibility is used to describe the process of understanding the needs of people with disabilities and creating digital products that work for anyone. So our job at Dig Inclusion is to advise organizations on how content can be made more accessible. And often that's quite a complicated thing to do. So we use a variety of methods to help companies understand that. And that can be from training, auditing, some consultancy, and also to provide some accessibility tools that will help people with the testing process. So that's a product that we've recently released called Hugger. And that provides a framework for testing so people can do more of the testing themselves and have less of reliance on third-party organizations like ourselves.
Okay, interesting stuff. The piece is that some of your work is not just sort of working as a service for someone else to help them get that into their day-to-day, into sort of training them to be able to do more themselves.
Yeah, I think so. That's where we find the most success. So the organizations that we engage with on a regular basis, they have the better results for accessibility. So I think if you roll back maybe, 10 or 12 years ago, the sort of internal consultancy services weren't really there. Organizations used to ask for an audit. You'd write up an audit and you would send that back to the client. And they would act on that or they wouldn't act on that because there wasn't much understanding around accessibility or budget. Over the past decade, I suppose that's changed quite a lot. And now organizations want to understand more about accessibility. They want to know how to get it right from the beginning. Accessibility is shift far more left now, so that developers need a better understanding and designers need a better understanding. And you find in that, even the BO and product owner tier, they want training too, so that they understand whether their products are meeting the accessibility needs of people with disabilities as well. So it is definitely more that, Tristan, in that organizations want a better understanding now. They don't want to know whether they've just passed or failed. They want to know how to produce accessible content consistently.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, we certainly work with partners for this area, and it's an important one. We often find it doesn't just help particular able or other parts of the business and their customers. It can actually just be improving the product in general and just making it more sort of seamless and more easy to use. So yeah, good stuff. And I mean, what brought you to this area?
I was working for a web development company at the time, and that was in Swansea. And we had a project, web accessibility was required. So the organization, it was a government organization, a learning organization, came to us and they said, well, we need this product to be accessible. And I didn't know what it meant. Nobody in the organization at the time really knew what it meant. And we asked and they said, well, blind people need to be able to use it. And to be honest, we thought that at that time that was just such a ridiculous concept because blind people can't see computers. How on earth are they going to use our application? But then, of course, after a small amount of reading, we discovered that it's the process of making things work for people with disabilities and that there were things like screen readers. So blind people could use a screen reader that would read the screen content back to them as long as it's built in an accessible way. And then we learned about how to make things work for people with mobility issues and people who are deaf and how to understand the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is a set of published guidelines around accessibility that have been around since 1999 in the first instance. So it was that really, it was the need to develop a product that was accessible for one of our clients that led me to find out more, to become very interested in the concept of accessibility and access by people with impairments. And I found myself really drawn to it. I think it's because I've always had an interest in disability, and also the design challenge of it is quite interesting as well, making something not just look pretty or work well for people with conventional needs of using a keyboard and a mouse, but also for people who use other types of assistive technology that's unconventional as well. And I find that fascinating.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it is an interesting area, and realizing that you can connect to the audience that you might be losing or missing out or making just hard to use your product. It's definitely an important one. We've seen it with the growth of sort of mobile phones or voice communication or other things in a sort of wider spectrum of people maybe not accessing it as computers were intended, of sitting with a keyboard and a mouse and a big screen straight in front of you, and that's the only thing you're doing, with sort of two hands and two eyes and senses. Is people might be only using one hand. They might not be looking at the screen. They might not be doing stuff. And that sort of starts to blur into people who that's their day-to-day experience is not being able to see and use that. So apart from people being sort of excluded from using a product if it can't be accessible, how can people think of the value or the being able to say, yes, this is working? I mean, is it very much a talking to actual people and putting things in hands of different people of abilities? Or where does this go to sort of how it fits into a process of improvement?
So that's good. You're asking there about, how do we know that we've succeeded? Is it testing with real users, or is it more of a technical conformance? And I think it's both is required, really. So with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, you've got a set of criteria, and they come in 3 different levels. So a single A criteria would be the types of things that you absolutely must have in a website. Otherwise, people are definitely going to have problems. So they're things like having an alternative text for an image. So someone who is blind can't necessarily see the content in an image. So you have to provide an alternative text for that can be read by the screen reader, so they know the content of that image or what that image does. And then you get the AA criteria, which is also very, very important. And people are likely to have difficulty if you don't include those AA criteria. And they include things like having sufficient color contrast for people with low vision. And then the AAA criteria are, to be honest with you, a lot of them are common sense design things. It's allowing the user to customize the website to their own requirements. And also maybe some enhancing some of the other criteria, like the AA criteria for color contrast, that's further enhanced in AAA to make it even more, increase the contrast for your content. So you've got these 3 sets of criteria. Most people go for the middle ground, which is a AA conformance, and that's what government agencies are requiring now. So the government has some new legislation called the Public Sector Bodies Accessibility Regulations, also referred to as PSBAR, that came out a couple of years ago, which means that all government websites now have to have a AA conformance requirement. And what we're finding is that the private sector are also taking notice of that and increasing their ability to deliver this conformance. So the first consideration for people, I suppose, is to have the technical conformance, to follow these guidelines. And at the AA level, there are 50 different guidelines. So there's a lot of things to consider for making your web content accessible. And that's the best starting point. So make sure that your content conforms to those guidelines, and that gets you onto a really good start for web accessibility. And then I would say that user testing is useful to understand where the usability of that content is in their particular needs as well. So you could build something that's technically conformant that may not meet the needs of people with disabilities because it's not very usable. So getting those both things right is important, but certainly technical conformance is where you start off from, because that does a lot of the work for you.
Right. When you're talking about different abilities, I mean, what's the sort of scope of this? I mean, presumably it's not just one classification. There's people who have very many different abilities and different sets of these things that are allowing them different access to using digital products.
Yeah, that's right. So we have it's useful for us to break disabilities down into 5 different types. And of course, there are combinations of disabilities. People don't necessarily just have one disability. They can have several. But in terms of understanding or thinking about the process of making something accessible, it's sometimes easier to, I suppose, come up with some broad personas or some groups of types of disabilities that need to be considered in every case. So the first one, which we've already talked about, is people who are blind. So this is people who have very low vision, can't necessarily see where the cursor is on the screen. They might not be able to see at all. So using a mouse isn't going to be possible for them. And we need alternatives for anything visual. So I've mentioned already images, but also things like forms, where you've got a form label, a piece of text telling you what a form field is for. Those need to be associated as well. So when the user finds the form field, that the form label is read along with it. And then you have people with low vision. So unlike people who are blind, People who have low vision or are partially sighted, they will use the screen, they will use a mouse, but they may have difficulty seeing content if it's not accessible, if it doesn't have sufficient color contrast, or if they can't resize the text to make it bigger to meet their own needs. That's the second group of users that we need to consider. So we've already got a consideration about non-visual design, and then we've got a consideration of visual design, but that design needs to meet the needs of people whose vision may not be that great. The third group of users then are people with mobility impairments. So people with mobility impairments may not be able to use a mouse again. So they may be just using a keyboard, or they may be using something called a switch. Now, what a switch is, it's a device that connects to your computer and it sends a signal to the computer to make a selection. And it's a very, very basic way of accessing a computer, and you can do anything, or you should be able to do anything on an accessible application just by pressing one button. And it's a process that people who have ever watched Stephen Hawking working or speaking, it's the same process that he would have used to communicate just by pressing one switch. And then the next group are people who are deaf. So people who are deaf generally have problems with video content that contains audio. So when there's audio within the video content, they can't hear that. So we need to have text alternatives for that in the form of captions. And then the last group of users are people who with cognitive impairments or neurodiversity. So these are people who may have learning difficulties or Asperger's or autism or short-term memory loss. And it's important to consider that group of users as well to make sure that the way that we present the information makes sense to them, that it's clear, and that we remove any distractions. So for that group of users, commonly the carousels, for example, where you see content moving or shifting at the top of a homepage can be very distracting for people with cognitive impairments. So one of the guidelines says that you need to be able to pause moving content. So that'll give the users enough time to read it and also to remove any distraction from the page that would otherwise inhibit them being able to use the rest of the page. So those are the 5 main groups of users that we think of. Of course, there are other disabilities as well and combinations that we need to consider too. And it's quite a complicated process making something digital work for people with all those different needs. But that's where the guidelines come in, and they're so useful, and where they have a benefit of a user test in the sense that the guidelines are for everybody. Whereas if you're doing user testing, it's very difficult to get a full spectrum of pan disability people to do the testing with you in a meaningful way. So that's the challenge. And that's why guidelines get you most of the way there. They make you think about all the different disability types.
Right. And obviously all of these, it's useful to have a classification, but often they are a sliding scale. And some people develop these changes in their own person as they get older, or maybe an accident or anything else like that. So it must make sense that this happens also for an internal workforce as well as a sort of customer facing product to adapt to.
Yeah, that's right. So we've worked with government organizations that have internal products, and the extra challenge that they have is meeting employment law. So employment says that you can't discriminate against someone with a disability in terms of providing them with an opportunity for employment. So if you've got an internal system that's not accessible, then you've got a big challenge there when someone with a disability that can't use the system. What are you going to do at that point? If you've got a system that doesn't work for that person, then giving them the job means that you're going to breach employment law in that they're not going to be able to do the job that you give them. But then also you can't refuse someone a job because your system doesn't work for them. So it's very important for organizations to understand the accessibility of their internal systems. And if there are any accessibility issues with them, that they should address those as well. So that's right. Yeah, it's not just the customer facing stuff that needs to be done. It needs to be the internal products as well. And they can be more challenging sometimes because with customer facing products, we can often build things bespoke or from scratch. But internal systems, they do have a tendency to be more off the shelf. So if you think of things like customer relationship management tools or HR tools, they tend to be off the shelf and people don't tend to build them from scratch. And that is where we see a lot of the problems with accessibility is with tools like that are internal, and nobody's really given much thought towards the accessibility of those. So, yeah, if there was a top tip for the day, I think, if you're in a large organization, just make sure that your internal systems work just as well as your external systems.
Indeed. I mean, have you got any other examples of showing, what does a sort of a common engagement look like, or successes you've had with working with companies?
Yeah, so we worked for years with a very big insurance company, and we've worked within lots of different departments with them. And we find that the best results that we get are when they engage with us at the start of the project. So when they begin to produce a new project or replace an old one, we'll tend to get involved at the wireframe stage where we're looking at issues that are common issues for accessibility. So for example, menu systems are frequently inaccessible. They are designed to work on hover. So you will hover over a main menu, then you'll get a mega menu drop down with more items on it, and then you can move your mouse down and select those. To make those work with a keyboard only, so without the mouse, it's not particularly difficult, but it's frequently not implemented. The way that you make that work with a keyboard is essentially just to make everything within the main menu or the top level of the menu tabbable. So that's using the tab key, you can reach them. And then with the enter key, you can expand those and you can use escape to collapse. So they're quite intuitive controls, actually. If you were thinking about building one for keyboard users, that's the way that you would just go ahead and do it. But it's often overlooked. We look at the wireframes, that's where we catch that sort of thing. And any other content that's a little bit unusual. We will then be involved in the design stage. So we will look at the designs, the color contrast, and pick out anything else that seems a little bit strange. And a lot of this, Tristan, is about good usability as well. So if we find that customers are getting a little bit creative to the point where the component or the content becomes less intuitive, then you'll often find that that's going to be an accessibility issue as well. And that's the great thing about accessibility. By providing a really good accessible experience, you're almost certainly, or you will certainly make it more usable as well, because you're having to have a deeper consideration about the way that people use things and how they work on different devices. So that example of the mega menus that I was just talking about, with something like that, if you make a mega menu that only works on hover, then it's not going to work very well on a touchscreen device either. And that's testing on touchscreen devices is often overlooked for things like iPad Pros or Microsoft Surface, which will render a desktop menu and not the mobile menu. And you'll see that if you've got accessibility issues with that menu, then they will reappear for people who are trying to use it in a conventional way on a large touchscreen device. So to continue that process with an organization, we would then do our unit testing with them, and we would go through some user journeys as well. And then we would go through the sign-off process after that, and then maintenance. So any small changes after that, we would check with them and make sure that they're accessible as well.
Does it then become part of a QA process or more part of a design process, or there's a blending between the two that it needs to work all the way through?
Yeah, so it's everything. So it's a design process, it's a QA process, it's a development process. Accessibility is everywhere. So it's very often thought about as a content issue. So if someone has put some content into a web page and they haven't provided a good alternative text for the image, then people will say, well, it's a content issue because, the person who put the content in there didn't put an alt attribute in. But then it's also a development issue because some of the content that we see within websites has nothing to do with the content team. It's to do with how the site was developed. And then, of course, it's got something to do with design also, because if you don't have an accessible design from the beginning, then your end product's not going to be accessible. So you can't put it down to any one area of development. It really is a holistic approach needs to be taken to making sure that accessibility is built into every stage. And I think that's something that a lot of companies are realizing now. If they're going to succeed at accessibility, they can't think of it at the end of a project and try and bolt it in and then just check things. And then when we come back with a list of issues, they'll fix them within a couple of days. That isn't the reality of the situation. Accessibility needs to be thought out about from beginning to end. And that's the only way that you're going to ensure that you're going to be successful. And that does provide a challenge for lots of organizations that are smaller, that don't have these sort of budgets, not just for the accessibility interventions, but also with the remediation that goes along with that. And so that is one of the reasons why we wanted to develop a tool that would help people with that. So that's the Hugger tool that we've developed. It's currently in beta, and that will be very useful for smaller organizations without budgets to be able to use it and learn more about the accessibility testing process as they're working within a tried and tested methodology.
Right. And are there particular challenges you see to businesses adopting processes like this?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge the biggest single challenge to business is cost. So even if you're talking about an organization that is doing quite well, they may not have budgeted for accessibility. So if this is their first exposure to it, they may think that they don't really need a budget, that it's a test that the internal team can run and that they will then, fix bugs and come out with a product that works well for everybody. And that's because they're thinking of it like functional testing. So most agencies can deal with their own functional testing, things like broken links or buttons that don't do what they're supposed to do. But accessibility isn't like that. It's quite a specialism. So if you talk to people about accessibility, they'll be able to pick out a few easy things like, well, I need alternative text for images and I need good color contrast. But there's 48 other criteria that need to be understood fully before you can deliver an accessible product. And that takes time. It takes time to test. It takes time to convey that information or to train up a team so that they've got a better understanding of accessibility. That takes time as well. And there are sometimes iterations of training. So in the first round of training, you may talk to people about the accessibility principles, but it's not until people have had the chance to practice putting those principles into their workflow that they really start to learn about accessibility and how it needs to be addressed. So sometimes there's another iteration of training or consultancy where you sit with the team and you'll talk to them about, what they found, what the challenges are, maybe talk to them about the current content that they're working on and work together to provide the most accessible experience for people. So the biggest challenge then is time and budget, I suppose, which in business are often the same thing because these things haven't been considered and there's a huge learning curve to get organizations up to speed on delivering accessibility. So I suppose before you talk about budget, it's awareness, it's organizations being aware that they need to do this. And that's become much better in the past 10 or 15 years because organizations are generally aware that this is something that they need to do. But then they have to, find budget to make sure that the things are tested properly and people are trained properly and you have the right processes in place. And that takes time. That really does take time. But it's the most successful way of doing things.
It's possibly, in a sense, the digital industry growing up and being more mature, that it sort of moved through things that maybe were being skipped or lacking in sort of past generations of security, privacy, sort of the GDPR, the penetration testing, the security testing, accessibility, usability. These are all things that start to become just the normal as the systems and the processes grow up and be more rounded fit for purpose.
Yeah, that is a really good way of putting it. I would say that's absolutely right. It is a lot like security or GDPR. Certainly a lot like security, whereby people didn't really think too much about it before, but then you had lots of cases where, people fell foul of security or GDPR and then people started to take notice. I think accessibility is probably lagging behind some of the other things that you mentioned in terms of people's awareness, but it is catching up. It's often thought of in the same way as security or some of those other services. It's just a must-have. So organizations are now aware that it's a must-have and it's not an optional thing. And they're now making moves towards making sure that they have it, have the understanding, and they know when something's been delivered to the right standard of accessibility.
Yeah. Where do you see the industry going, either from adoption or from your side, as to what you're able to sort of achieve and blend into a good flow in the next sort of like 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. Well, I see that the adoption is going to increase. So I think it's going to become more a part of the business vocabulary. So people will be talking about accessibility more. It will become a part of everybody's testing requirements. So instead of it being an add-on or a bolt-on thing at the end of a project, it will become more integrated in everything that's been done. And I think that accessibility will become more part of functional testing rather than where it sits very often at the moment within non-functional testing. I think we'll see a promotion of the importance of that. So in the next 5-10 years, I see there's probably going to be a lot more employment in accessibility. I think that agencies are already starting to create roles for accessibility managers within their organizations. So you get roles now that you see popping up on LinkedIn and other places, which are digital accessibility managers. The big leap that I think is starting to happen is machine learning. So because accessibility testing is so time consuming and it's so often, in lots of cases, it's very difficult as well. I think we're going to need some more help from machines just so we can get through content quickly. So currently there's a lot of automated testing tools out there, and they have varying degrees of success in detecting accessibility issues. But there is still a lot of false positives, a lot of false negatives with those automated testing tools, which means that the reliability is, I would say, quite low. So you're always going to need manual testing to go along with that. But machine learning, where we can tell, we can show a computer that, this is a good example, or this is 700 good examples, and this is 700 bad examples. Machine learning should help to make that whole process easier and more accurate in testing. And then the requirement for manual verification of those issues may become less over time. So I see that as a big thing. And the last thing I see that's going to change in the landscape, probably in the next 1 or 2 years, is litigation. So in the UK, we've got a culture of people just accepting what they've got. It's the stiff upper lip thing, where if people can't access a specific thing, then they'll say, oh, well, no worries, I'll go somewhere else and I'll get that product or that service from another place. We can see that over in the US, there's lots and lots of litigation around accessibility. So people aren't doing that. They're saying, well, this has caused me damages. I feel discriminated against. So I'm now going to approach that company and I'm going to get those damages. So I think we might see that. Well, I'm pretty sure that we're going to see that creeping we're going to see some case law for that in the UK over the next couple of years. It's probably overdue, but accessibility has reached such a high visibility now that I think it's inevitable that we're going to have some case law in the next couple of years where we actually see people who can't access digital content taking companies to court over it. That's going to change our industry a lot. At the moment, we've got quite a comfortable industry where customers approach us and we help them. But I think there may be a little bit more desperation in the future where people have run into trouble and they're going to need some help to get out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we certainly see at the professional end, there is always a need to have people who are specifically trained and it just gets through things faster. But as people have become more aware and have learned through this in 1 or 2 projects internally at companies, it starts to become much more natural for them to be thinking about these processes and being more aware of the sort of community. And the cost and the effort does slowly come down. It's sort of a learnt process as much as it is a tacked on need sort of thing, or a sort of specialist profession sort of thing. I think it's good to start getting more people more aware and not blocking out part of their potential audience. It's been great talking with you today, and just sort of rounding this out. There's obviously on that legal side and things that you've spoken of people don't want to be both feeling that their customers or potential customers are having trouble with their products and feeling bad, or other government agencies coming back to them. But is there ways that companies who may not feel necessarily they're aware of what they could be doing or whether there is a need there? Because I think this can be found with certain sort of sectors that if people don't have a list of complaints or a list of issues, then they just don't think that issue is there. Is there any sort of advice you could give to companies for them being more aware of when they are not servicing a percentage of the population so well?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I would say that if you're in an organization and you have a responsibility for accessibility in some capacity, and you're not sure whether you have an issue or not, you almost certainly do have an issue. Because if it's not something that's being talked about within your organization, or it's something that you're leaving until the end of the project, then you're probably in a bit of a precarious situation. So my advice would be, my first port of call would be to get an audit on whatever you're creating, or if it's very early in the process, then you're in a better position. And I would say just engage with an accessibility company and get some advice on what you're doing. And whatever you have, it doesn't matter whether it's just a wireframe or some initial designs, or even if you're still in the discovery phase, having that conversation with a web accessibility organization, understanding what needs to be done at important points in the project and where you need those interventions, that would be your best thing to do. Because if you're going into a project without considering accessibility, then you're not going to get it right. It's guaranteed you're not going to get it right. And it's not going to be something that you can fix at the end. That's a very common, I suppose, misunderstanding about accessibility, that you can easily fix it at the end. Things are a lot more difficult to fix at the end. They cost more. The results aren't as good. So it's definitely something that you need to be thinking about through the whole process. And the other thing about that is that if you're not having those conversations about accessibility, then it does mean that you don't have the right level of awareness to be able to deliver it properly as well. So yeah, the first protocol is get an audit or get a consultant in and have a conversation with them about what you're doing and what your intentions are. Or if you've already got a product, get that checked. And that would be your starting point. And an audit is always a good way to start a conversation. But if you're in a new role in an organization and you're unsure about the abilities of the current team, then some training would be a good idea as well. So just get a consultant in or a trainer and help that team to understand accessibility better. That's always a really good move as well. And the more people that you can involve in that training, the different roles, will be beneficial, because it just needs to be a conversation. If you're in an organization where you're not talking about accessibility, one of the best things that you can do is start communicating about accessibility in a productive way. And to do that, you need to understand the language of accessibility. So accessibility or web accessibility has its own language and terms and jargon, and people in all roles throughout the organization need to understand what they are and what people are talking about when they say things like status updates or reflow, which are accessibility principles.
Great. And just to round out the interview, I just like to throw people a bit of a fun challenge at the end. If you could make one of your clients into a superhero and they're backed into the corner trying to fight their way out, are there any couple of things that would be good to come to hand to save the day and win this metaphorical situation? Thinking of accessibility.
With accessibility, okay. Well, yeah, I would say that knowledge, I think, if you could implant knowledge into the client, that would be the best win. So you know that scene in The Matrix or those scenes where they plug people into the Matrix and they learn how to do Kung Fu or something like that. I think plugging someone in and just giving them all the accessibility knowledge that they need, that would be the superpower. That really would be, because, that is where the success lies, is knowing what to do in a situation, how to plan for accessibility, and then ultimately how to deliver it.
Yeah. And obviously what we're talking about here is not a sort of a feature checklist. We're talking about people and being able to work with more people and they're feeling that they can purchase or work with or use your product. It's not just a sort of abstract standard. So I think that's a good one, of being more aware of each other. So that's been great being able to
absolutely
have the time of talking with you. If people wanted to be able to get in contact with yourself or your organization, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about it, or where's best to get in contact?
Yeah, sure. So you can find me on LinkedIn. So Grant Broome on LinkedIn. There's not many around, so I'm pretty easy to find that way. Or you can come to our website at diginclusion.com, or you can contact me at grant@diginclusion.com, or just Google for Dig Inclusion, and then you'll find us that way as well. That's probably the easiest thing. And we've got a contact form on our website. So yeah, all the usual ways, Tristan, that you would find people, you can find us that way too.
Cool. And your product quickly too, if people wanted to join the beta program for Hugger and things, that's also available online to get access to, is it?
Yeah, so anyone can sign up at any time now. So we've opened it up completely. So we are still working on it, but we're already finding that people are developing and publishing reports. We've had hundreds of people sign up since we've released it. It seems to be very, very popular. There's a lot of interest in it and how people use it. And I think people are really seeing the benefits of having a tool that not only provides you the framework for testing, but teaches you accessibility as you go. So you can find that at hugger.app. So that's HUGR.app. And you can just sign up for it there and start using it within seconds. One thing I should say is we've called it .app. It is a desktop application primarily. We are getting it to work on mobile phones, but because it uses a spreadsheet, a desktop is probably the most suitable format for using it.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for joining us again today and give us a bit more of an understanding of this important space.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tristan. It's been really nice talking to you.
Thank you for joining us today on the Cliff Notes podcast. We hope you've enjoyed and learned more about the subject. And if you want to get in contact with myself or the guests, they will be available in the show notes page on cliffnotespodcast.com. And please go out there and tell a friend, share, like, and subscribe on all the normal social media channels. Ask us any questions or recommendations you want to have for following shows.